I am Wendar, and please don't tell anyone I messed up this shot. Now today we're going to be looking at a photo that I took fairly recently. It was actually not too long ago, May 25th, 2018, as you can see down here, so just like a month ago. And I wanted to pick this photo specifically because even with a lot of experience, this is now a year shooting with my camera, I'm still making mistakes all the time, and I want to look at what I did wrong and what I could have done to fix it instead. Now, the first thing I want to do is check the exposure of the image, and for this one in particular, the histogram up here is a little bit deceiving because it's analyzing the entire photo, whereas obviously I exposed specifically so that areas like up here, for example, don't have a lot of detail in them. My main focus was trying to get the lights down here, and this is actually Atlantic City back here, so I'm taking a photo of Atlantic City from the beach across the bay. And so these lights up here, these are the buildings of Atlantic City, and I was specifically exposing for them. Now obviously there's a lot of things that are wrong with this photo, but actually the exposure isn't really one of them. So we can look here at the histogram, and it looks like things are just falling off a cliff down to the left side of the histogram, but actually, like I said, I don't want this detail down here to be the main focal point of the photo. I don't want the detail up here, maybe the stars in the sky that could have been up here or a plane going by. I wasn't exposing for that, and so if we were going to get more of an accurate depiction of what is going on here, I can just jump in really quickly into the crop mode, and I'll show you in a second here, and basically just crop down into this photo. And right now we already see the histogram is expanding a lot because we're just isolating this area of the photo, so we're getting rid of all of the dark areas that I specifically wasn't exposing for, only the buildings and the light. And you can see up here now that the histogram is a lot better. It's not perfect because this crop isn't perfect in terms of what we're specifically focusing on with this crop here. But for the most part, you can see that the image is actually pretty much properly exposed, at least for the parts that I was trying to expose for. So I'm just gonna exit out of that really quickly. So coming back to the main photo, I don't know if you can tell on the monitors that you're looking on, you can see some banding issues up here. That's not actually a problem with the photo, that's a problem with the lack of processing, and I can get rid of that really quickly. I was going through the raw file, and I got rid of that really quickly just in the develop module here in Lightroom, so don't worry about that for now. But in terms of exposure, this is pretty much spot on. There's nothing really wrong with it, I think, in my opinion. If anything, it's overexposed. If we zoom in down here into the lights, you can see that this stuff is all blown out here. All these really bright, large lights almost seem to be blown out, and that's partially due to the blur, which I'll hit on a little bit later, but I think it's also a problem with the exposure. So if anything, I'm actually overexposed and not underexposed, but I don't think that's true either. Now zooming back out, I want to look at the focus of the image. So where was it focused, and I want to see if I hit the focus or not. Now obviously this is more of like a landscape shot or a cityscape shot, a skyline shot, whatever you want to call it, and so the focus isn't super important in terms of nailing. Like on a portrait you want to nail the eyes. There isn't something specifically like that, it's just trying to nail the entire image and everything out here. So I'm given a little bit more leeway in terms of where the focus can be, and I'm still hitting it kind of. So I just want to go across the bottom of the image here, or not the bottom of the image, but the bottom of the cityscape here, and coming from the left to the right, and hopefully this isn't too disorienting for you to watch, coming from the left to the right, the focus actually seems pretty spot on. Now it's hard to tell because there's a lot of motion blur here, and again I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but from what I see here, I mean the focus is on the buildings, clearly, and I'm shooting this at, let me pull up the settings here in a second. So pulling up my settings here, I'm shooting at f5.6, which is fine, it's decent, it works fine for landscapes like this, so I should be hitting my focus, and I feel like I am. Again, with the motion blur, it's hard to tell. Now, moving on to said motion blur, I'm going to get rid of this here in a second. Oh, here we go, zooming in. Obviously there's a lot of motion blur going on in this photo, and if we look at how long the exposure was, this was a 15-second long exposure, which is a long time. And now I had this camera mounted on a tripod. Of course, it's on the beach, and this was at night where the waves were crashing in, the wind was going crazy, and I don't have really a great tripod. I make do with what I have, and so there was still a lot of shaking, obviously, as you can see, from the 15-second long exposure. So what I could have done to counteract that, and let's zoom back out. I mean, you can see how bad the motion blur is, stuff like this. It's like growing a different pair of lights. It's like you're seeing double all over the photo. So there's obviously something wrong. Now if we zoom back out to the settings, you can see I was shooting it at 5.6, which is fine, letting in a lot of light. 15 seconds, letting in a lot of light. ISO 100. Now, this was my mistake, and this was completely my fault, but I could have very easily bumped the ISO up to 200, 300, 400, even like 500 or 600 on this camera. That's perfectly reasonable, perfectly fine. We're not going to get a lot of grain in a shot like that, even at ISO like 600. And that would have let me drastically reduce the exposure time for this shot, and I wouldn't have picked up nearly as much motion blur, so that would have been very, very helpful for me to do. And now listen, this was late at night. I'm not trying to make excuses for myself, but clearly I wasn't thinking straight or properly. I could have easily bumped up the ISO and then brought down the shutter speed, and everything would have come out much, much, much better, much sharper, much clearer, without any of the blur that we see here. So unfortunately I didn't do that. We end up with this blurry photo here. That's what you're seeing right now. Now the last section that I want to touch on is composition, and like I said, this was on the beach and I was putting a tripod down on the beach. My tripod is a little bit lopsided in itself, and then on top of that we were on a beach, and so the three legs were clearly not level. You can see that the horizon here is not level at all. We're falling off a cliff to the left. We're sliding down the mountain basically. And I didn't have any problem with that because I always knew that if I got the shot right, I could always rotate it, and that would be fine. That's a fine crop of rotate way of fixing that in post. But aside from that, I feel like the composition, if I were to do that, and I can do that right now actually so we can see, and I can just rotate this. I'm cutting a little bit of the image off, unfortunately, but you know, sometimes you gotta make do with what you have, and I don't have the best tripod, like I was saying. Oh, now we're falling off to the right. Okay, let me redo that. So I came and I cropped the image so it's a little bit more of a straight horizon, and we cut off a bit of the left side and a bit of the right, but I specifically left space there on the right, knowing that I would have to rotate it in post, so that's fine. I don't know why it's so pixelated right now. And what we see here is that the composition really isn't that bad. So especially after rotating, I left space on the right, specifically knowing that I'd have to rotate this in post. We cut off a little bit of the stuff on the left. That's just something we're gonna have to deal with. Like I said, given the equipment and the location that we're on, there was such a slant that I would have to bring it back in post anyway. But aside from that, I feel like the composition is pretty good. Now there's a sort of rule of thirds going on here in terms of, and this crop, the rotation crop isn't perfect as you can see, but there's a sort of rule of thirds being followed here, which I like. The horizon is not perfectly centered, which is good because there's more space up here than on the bottom. I think in a perfect world I would have done 2 exposures, and I would have exposed for the sky and then exposed for the cities, and I would have combined them somehow, layering the 2 images on top of each other. But obviously I didn't even get the one photo right, so I wasn't too worried about getting 2 photos right. Now aside from that, the composition was fine. Like I was saying, we didn't really crop anything too badly, as you can see. Even the stuff that we cut off, it was originally cut off in weird places, so even with the rotation crop, we worked out just fine. And so that is all. So that is the image that we had to fix. I messed up the shot completely. It's really a shame because I'm probably never going to get an opportunity like this in my life again, to photograph Atlantic City from across the bay at night with the lights shining all up. But you know what? I messed it up, it's my fault, and now we've looked at it, we've analyzed it, we've understood, and now we know what I could have done differently if I wanted to get the right shot in camera. So it's a good learning experience. I think I learned a lot from this and from analyzing my own photo, and hopefully you learned and enjoyed along with me.